Alhambra Productions presents The Attributes of God with Dr. Omar Farouq Abdullah and Sheikh Hamza Yusuf.
Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. The attributes of God in Islam. I'm sure by now most of you have flipped through the program and seen the topics that have been identified. I'll just run through the topics very quickly. The philosophy of religion, creed or chaos, right thinking regarding God, self-knowledge as theology, creed as experience, and finally, vicegerency, realities, and responsibilities. These topics were carefully selected, and the specific subtopics, themes, and information that will be presented have been carefully reviewed and aggregated by our scholars. This is a detailed presentation of very specific material which will, God willing, give all of us, as I said earlier, a greater appreciation of our understanding of God according to the Islamic doctrine, according to the Islamic creed. Now, why is it important to study theology? Why spend time studying theology when, as a lot of people say, we have more practical problems to worry about? And not to be dismissive, but this question reveals an inherent misunderstanding of what's wrong with the Muslim world. As our dear brother and scholar Dr. Suleiman Niang has so rightfully pointed out, ideology is the wallpaper that covers the cracks of logic. Ideology is the wallpaper that covers the cracks of logic. Meaning that people afraid to confront the logical holes in their theology will instead resort to ideology. And what we need now more than ever is a correct appreciation and a correct understanding of theology and not any more rhetoric. For indeed it is our subversion into rhetoric that has caused the Muslim decay and that has brought us to the point that the Muslim Ummah is in. So it is our hope that today, in our small way, that Nawawi Foundation and our scholars presenting to us and all of us being here together will hopefully contribute towards an appreciation of right theology. Now, on a personal note, I want to tell you that I was born into a Muslim family, and I grew up Muslim right here in Chicago. And of course, Dr. Omar and Imam Hamza both converted to Islam. And it's interesting to me that Allah Ta'ala talks about in the Quran the fact that if the Muslims don't do what they're supposed to do, Allah Ta'ala replaces them with people who will do what the Muslims are supposed to do. It's interesting to note that so many of our teachers, so many of our mashayikh, so many of our ulama to whom we turn for guidance are people that Allah Ta'ala brought into this deen. They weren't born into it. They didn't take it for granted as I did growing up. Now at the same time, let me tell you something. Growing up as a young Muslim in America with parents from the subcontinent, I always struggled with my religion as a young person. I'm sure a lot of people can relate to this sitting in this room right now. Why? Well, the main reason was because whenever I'd ask questions about religion, I never seemed to get a straight answer. I never seemed to get an answer which satisfied my intellectual curiosity. I would always get a slap on the head. Don't ask any more questions and go do namaz. And this was highly unsatisfactory and highly unsatisfying. And it wasn't until I actually came in contact with people like Dr. Omar and Imam Hamza that finally my questions began to get answered. Finally, I discovered that there is a rich intellectual tradition within Islam, and there are Muslim scholars alive in humanity today who have kept that tradition alive. And they have passed it on from generation to generation, and indeed it is a tremendous honor to sit at their feet and to benefit from them. So it is with this intention that we have invited our distinguished scholars here today, and inshallah it is with this intention that all of us should be here, which is an appreciation of the fact that they are keeping alive a rich tradition from within our religion. And that said, without further ado, I would like to invite Imam Hamza Yusuf, who without a doubt, I can unabashedly say, is probably one of the singular human beings who has altered the course of my life, and I could say dozens of my close friends and associates. I think it goes without saying that among the American Muslim intelligentsia, there are few intellectuals, few Muslim scholars who can rival the contributions that Imam Hamza has made. And I'm saying this in front of him not to embarrass him, but to put it in context. So inshallah, without further ado, I would ask Imam Hamza Yusuf, who all of you know is the director of the Zaytuna Institute based in California. He will inshallah say a few words about Dr. Omar, and then Dr. Omar will of course reintroduce him in a more detailed fashion, and then Imam Hamza will proceed with his first presentation. Imam Hamza Yusuf.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Wa sallallahu ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam taslima. Wa la hawla wa la quwwata illa billahi al-ali al-azim. Alhamdulillah. First of all, I want to say that I'm very appreciative and also actually really surprised at how many people would be interested in this subject. On the other hand, I'm also surprised at how many people aren't interested in the subject, given that it's really the only interesting subject, because it's the subject of ultimate concern, as some theologians have remarked, that theology is the study of what has ultimate concern, which is God. I first met Dr. Omar over 20 years ago in Spain. We met in a madrasa there. It was a very beautiful madrasa, and it was in the city of Granada, which was a city of great Islamic learning. And there's a famous book that was written called Al-Ihata fi Akhbari Granada, encompassing all the news about Granada. And it's 3 huge volumes, which is detailed discussion about the great scholars and the history of the city. I met Dr. Omar there, and I was struck at that time because I was in a sense just starting my studies, and Dr. Omar was already deeply knowledgeable in many, many subjects. And over these last 20 years, what I have seen is just this continual commitment to discovery. The Arabs, their word for discovery is also the word for ecstasy, because the most extraordinary and delightful experience human beings can have is to find out something new, to discover something. And the greatest discovery is the discovery of God. And that's why the essential attribute that our scholars gave God was the attribute of what can be discovered, or the existent one, the one that can actually be found, that is God's essential attribute. God is not only real, but God is something that we can find in our lives. That's what I've seen in my teacher, Dr. Omar, who is somebody who's been on this path of setting out to find God. My many fortunate trips to Saudi Arabia, I would always try to visit and spend very fruitful time, not nearly as much as I would have liked to, but all of those times that I was afforded that opportunity, I benefited greatly, and that's what's called the jalis. The Prophet ﷺ said that a sound companion is like the seller of musk, that if you sit with them, they'll either give you some, or you can buy some from them, or you can at least just get a beautiful smell, the fragrance of that company. I have a friend who I've been, for probably several years, been buying perfume from in Jeddah, and he always gives me more than I ever buy. And I'm always reminded, visiting him, of that hadith. So the Prophet ﷺ, his descriptions are the most apt, and that's why we're very fortunate to have this musk seller who gives more than he sells. Jazakumullah khairan.
Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wassalatu wassalamu ala Rasulillah wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'een. Like Imam Hamza, I am impressed by this turnout. And I am personally honored by the fact that so many of you have honored us with your presence today. I know that Imam Hamza will be equal to the task. I pray that I can also be equal to it. This is the most noble of all subjects. As Imam Hamza said, this is the ultimate concern of all human beings. And especially in the time that we live, a time of great knowledge, unimaginable knowledge, that knowledge has to be grounded, just like electricity is grounded, and it has to be made meaningful. This was one of the supreme legacies of Islamic civilization, and it remains our task today. And the grounding of that knowledge is in the discovery of God, and of relating all of that knowledge to the supreme cosmological truth. I am strengthened by the presence of my ally and my teacher and my guide, who is Imam Hamza. As he mentioned, we met when I was already in my 30s and he was a very young man. He was 16 years old at that time. And I have never seen Imam Hamza as anything less than a superior, even at that time. When I met him in this beautiful garden in Granada, where we had a wonderful school, I was impressed from the very beginning by the intensity of this young man and by the perception that he had. And it's said in the famous tradition which is attributed to Ibn Abbas and to others, "Man amila bima alima warathahu Allahu ilma ma lam yakun ya'lam." Whoever will put in practice what they know, God will give them as an inheritance knowledge of what they did not know. And this has always been the characteristic of my beloved brother, because of the fact that he always put into practice what he knew. And as his knowledge increased, his practice changed. But you could always know what he was learning by where he was and what he was doing. And I know that whatever Imam Hamza believes, he will do that. He will apply it. And therefore his knowledge increases. From the time that I met Imam Hamza, I saw him as a vanguard. The vanguard, of course, are the troops that go before the army and that check out the territory and that open up the ground, because this is what he always was for me. When he met me the first time, I had been given a task, which was to teach the Ajurumiyya and Arabic to that community in Spain that we had, and quite frankly, I didn't know what the Ajurumiyya was. I had studied Arabic in the Oriental fashion, but I'd never studied it in the traditional, and never been able to because of the fact that when I opened the book of Sibawayh, which was the place to end and not begin, it was so difficult I couldn't get beyond the first chapter. So he brought to me not only the text of the Ajurumiyya, but he brought to me also a beautiful English commentary of it, which remains one of the best that is available to this day. And he brought other books as well. And as God graced us through our lives that have always intertwined, the word marriage in Latin comes from a root meaning to take two trees or two vines and to have them grow up parallel to each other and then intertwine over each other to make an arch. That's the metaphor of marriage in the Latin tradition. And it pertains to human beings as well as to spouses. So our lives have always been intermarried like that. And Imam Hamza has always been the teacher to me. He's always in the vanguard. He's always brought me new materials. He's always pointed in new directions. And sometimes I've studied him from afar, sometimes close at hand. I know that most of you know him as well as I. And I know that although your turnout today is a great honor to us, especially because it's an honor of the knowledge that we hold dear, I also know that if it were not for the presence of this luminary, that the turnout would probably be much more modest. So thank you very much for coming. Thank you for honoring Sheikh Hamza. Thank you for honoring me. I pray to God that we can fulfill our task and that we can make this a beneficial session so that we not only enjoy each other's presence, but that we also learn.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم تسليما ولا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله العلي العظيم. اللهم لا علم لنا إلا ما علمتنا إنك أنت العليم الحكيم. اللهم علمنا ما ينفعنا وانفعنا بما علمتنا وزدنا علما. وصل اللهم على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم تسليما. Alhamdulillah, the topic at hand of this gathering is the attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And what both Dr. Omar and I decided that we would do is begin with an introduction. And this came from, in my Western studies, I had the good fortune of studying with a Western theologian. I had two courses with him. One was the philosophy of religion, another was epistemology. Very brilliant man. And the one on philosophy looked at the phenomenon of religion and how frameworks relate to religion. In other words, how we attempt to understand religion within frameworks of thought. Because religion as a phenomenon, as a human phenomenon, and it is a global and universal phenomenon. As a phenomenon, it is more related to experience in its initial stages than it is to anything intellectual. It's not initially framed in intellectual frames of reference, but rather experiential. And the first generation in every religion is always the most extraordinary. If you look at any religious tradition, you will find that the first generation had something that none of the later generations have. This is consistent in all of the world religions. Now, what's also consistent and fascinating is that all of these religions have almost identical problems, but they're problems because of the nature of the particular tradition will manifest in different ways, but essence, they are very similar problems. And Islam is certainly not an anomaly in that. The problems that we as Muslims encountered early on in our tradition were encountered by other traditions before Islam. Islam has a unique vantage point in that it was the last of the great world religions. And for that reason, the Quranic text deals with previous traditions and some of their troubles. One of the things about the Jewish tradition is that the Jewish tradition does not have an understanding of the Islamic tradition within their early text. The Christian tradition has an understanding of the Jewish tradition, but not an understanding of the Islamic tradition. Whereas when you get to Islam, we have an understanding of these two Abrahamic faiths, and in that way are a completion of them and a clarification. And this is one of the beauties to me of Islam, is that when you become a Muslim, you are becoming a Jew and a Christian as well. That we, in a sense, embrace them even though both of them reject us. The Christians embrace the Jews, in essence, because they recognize the validity of Jewish tradition. But the Jews do not embrace the Christians. Whereas the Muslims embrace both. And the greatest proof of that is the fact that we are sanctioned to marry both Christian and Jewish women. I mean, I think this is a clear indication from God, is that not only is it a figurative embrace, but it can also be a literal embrace of those traditions. And it is prohibited for Muslims to prevent their wives from attending synagogue or church and completing their sacraments in their own faith. Islam does have that wonderful aspect that is absent in certainly the second other great Abrahamic tradition, which is Christianity. Judaism is a much smaller phenomenon. So what happens in religion is interesting, because what happens in religion is, in a sense, a manifestation of archetypes that are replicated in all of these different traditions. And that's why you will find, even within traditions, very similar expressions of the religious personality. That we have people in Islam that are very similar to people that are found in Christianity and in Judaism. In fact, they often will have more in common with their Christian counterparts than they have with other Muslims, or with their Jewish counterparts than they have with other Muslims, in their behavior and also in their understanding. And that is also very interesting. And one of the things that Ibn Taymiyyah rahimahullah said, was that when Muslims go astray, they go astray like the Jews go astray or like the Christians go astray. In other words, he was recognizing and articulating archetypal deviancy. That when you deviate as a deviation. It doesn't matter whether what tradition you're coming from. They are forms of deviancy. Now, the other aspect of trying to put religion into a frame of understanding is that it is a process. That when the phenomenon of religion enters into the world, either as a restorative event, which happened with the Jewish prophets who would come, like John the Baptist is within Judaic tradition, and we also recognize Jesus ﷺ as being in that tradition. But then you have radical breaks within religious tradition, and one of them obviously is Islam. Islam makes a radical departure from Judaism and Christianity in the same way that Christianity made a radical departure from Judaism. So you have a continuity, but then at certain periods in history you have these breaks, and those breaks need to be understood also. When they occur, if you asked, for instance, the Sahaba, radiyallahu anhum, if you asked them what was happening to them, they would not, I don't believe that they would explain it in the way that we would explain it now. In other words, the terms, the frames of references that they would use would not be ours. And that occurs because of a distance. When you are experiencing the world without mediary in this immediate sense, that is very different from somebody who is looking at a phenomenon from outside of it because of that historical distance. And you will have different understandings based on the time and the place that you're coming from. So we as a people now will understand the Islamic tradition in ways that are different from people 100 years ago or 200 years ago. We cannot deny the historic reality of where we were born, of the circumstances. Even factors like socioeconomic factors have influence. It's Abu Hanifa radiallahu anhu, the fact that he is a non-Arab will influence his madhab. And if you don't recognize that when you study it, about certain rulings that he gave, and there are rulings that I feel more comfortable, even though I'm a Maliki, I feel more comfortable with Abu Hanifa as an Ajami, as a non-Arab. And so you can deny that, and you can say that's not true, but I think that you do it to your detriment because you're not recognizing the enriching element that provides. As people have gifts, and when they come into Islam, they bring their gifts with them. Every people have gifts, and those gifts are not the same. Allah distributes His gifts differently amongst people. And one of the things Sidi Ahmed Zarruq said, he said that you have to know the wisdom of diversity. And when you go to a land, you have to understand that those people are not the same as the land that you are coming from. That they have differences, that we have universals that we share. Every human being shares them. But we also have particulars. And if you lose sight of one without the other, and this is one of the big debates in Islam between the philosophers and the theologians, because the philosophers said God only knows the universals. The philosophers said God only knows the universals. The theologians said no, God knows the universals and the particulars. If you ignore the particulars, then you do so, it will have tragic consequences. And so each people that came into Islam brought with them gifts. The Persians in particular brought extraordinary gifts into Islam. The Hellenic tradition also gave extraordinary gifts, and that came through the Byzantine influence. You can see a clear difference between scholars that are writing in the pre-Hellenistic period and the scholars that are writing in the post-Hellenistic period. You can witness the way that knowledge becomes classified, the logical structuring of their thought. All of these things you can see was a direct influence on intellectual gifts that were introduced into the community. And so these are part of the enrichment and the process of understanding who we are, what we believe, and what our religion is. And that is why the argument that there's no knowledge except the Salaf period, this argument that
We accept only this one period of time, and after that, it's everybody goes astray. That argument is denying something so elemental to our human experience, and that is the increase of knowledge in our own lives, our own evolution, as we grow and come to know more. And also the gifts that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given peoples and times and places. That to live in Cordoba in the 9th century must have been just an extraordinary experience. And what they knew and what they were thinking about and what they were discussing, to deny all of that as somehow being innovative or unnecessary or extraneous is, I think, to really throw a gift of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala away. And so what I would like to look at now is, in a sense, an attempt to understand how we frame our experience and how that relates to creed. Now, every religion is founded upon direct experience of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Now, that does not necessarily negate the mediary of the angel. But what I'm talking about, direct experience, is that it is not a rational, cognitive process. That what happens to prophets who have this direct experience of the noumenal realm, and we know that the Prophet ﷺ saw the angelic realm, and that is a direct experience. In other words, if we all went outside right now, and we could see from one horizon to the other horizon, and as far up in the sky as we could look, the angel Jibreel, and all of us saw that together, how would that affect our practice as Muslims? See, if I just told you that the Prophet ﷺ saw the entire horizon, the celestial sphere, fill up with an angelic being, and that was his experience. Now, the interesting thing about experience is not a logical proposition. You cannot prove or disprove experience. You can discuss it, you can interpret it, but you cannot say it's true or it's false. Experience is real for the one experiencing it. What then is the challenge is to determine whether or not that experience has an objective reality or a subjective reality. In other words, is that experience a true experience, or is it somehow something that's happening to this individual as a type of psychosis? Because we have people now that speak to God directly. They hear God. We have people living today that literally will tell you, and they're not lying. You can't say they're lying, because these people are in delusional states and they have auditory hallucinations, and sometimes also they actually see things. And these things are very real to them. Now, one of the interesting things about the Catholic Church, and I find this really fascinating because this is 4th century doctrine. The Catholic Church determined how to differentiate between a true divine experience, and this relates to prophets and saints, and between a demonic experience, because they too believe in the demonic realm like we do. The way they differentiate is that a demonic experience is always accompanied with an expansion of the self. In other words, it's a very exciting and joyful experience, and it is followed with despair. And a true spiritual experience is exactly the opposite. The initial experience is incredible constriction and fear and dread, and it is followed with a sense of expansion and joy. This is in their doctrine. This is actually doctrinal in Catholic tradition. Now, if we look at the experience of the Prophet ﷺ, if we look at the experience of Moses, Musa, la takhaf. Moses, when he had this experience, was filled with fear. Ibrahim, also the Prophet Muhammad. This is consistent with what we see in the Quran, and also what the Christians and the Jews understand within their traditions, is that this religious experience is overwhelming, incapacitates the self. And I personally believe that the Prophet ﷺ went into a state of shock. Because if you look at the description of his initial experience, as if a physician, and I worked in a trauma center and had to study that, just how to identify people in different stages of shock, that if a physician looks at the descriptions of what happened to him, he was in a state of shock. Now, one of the most interesting things to me about his state was because of the vastness of his soul. And Ibn Qayyim al-Jawziyah rahimahullah said that the soul of the Prophet is bigger than this cosmos. In Kitab al-Ruh, that he actually says that the Prophet ﷺ, the magnanimity of his soul, the vastness of his soul is beyond our comprehension. That one of the things that is so extraordinary about his presence of mind is, despite the fact that he was going through the physical and autonomic nervous system's experience of shock, his mind was completely present, which is absent in a normal human being. When they go into shock, they lose the ability to think. And the proof for me in that is what he said to his wife, Zammiluni, Zammiluni. Zammiluni means wrap me up. Now we know that patients who are given shock, that one of the first things you do is you wrap them up. You're actually told to wrap them, to cover them up, to create some containment, because part of shock is a loss of self. It's when the outward and the inward crash. There's just a massive crash that occurs, and so the experience of psychic integrity, of the soul being, the self being whole, is shattered because something has forced itself in on the soul. And so the Prophet ﷺ, whatever happened to him in that cave, and one of the extraordinary things about that was the actual squeeze that Jibreel gave to the Prophet. And there were 3 squeezes. And the Prophet ﷺ, what it's reported is that he used kana yatahannath. He used to go and do this thing called tahannuth. And tahannuth in the Arabic language, if you look, almost always the commentators put next to it ta'abbud. But if you look at the word hinth is actually shirk. And tahannuth is to remove oneself. Tajannub is tafa'ul form in Arabic. One of the purposes of it in morphology is to avoid something. So tahajjud is to avoid sleep. Hujud is sleep. Takalluf, tahammul, that's actually from takalluf. But tajannub is to avoid nearness to somebody, the jamb. And tahannuth is to avoid shirk. The Prophet ﷺ, at the early stage of his life, he was going to the cave in order to remove himself from the exterior world of all of these forms and go into a place at night and do what he was doing. And it was a Hanific practice. It was a practice of those people, probably akin to what we would call today meditation, that he was in a contemplative state. His desire was the desire to empty out forms, because the soul has to be emptied of forms before it can have knowledge of the one who has no form, because forms will impinge on that understanding. And so what Jibreel, according to some of our scholars like Imam al-Halabi, says that the squeezing was actually squeezing any remnant out of his soul from the world, from his historical circumstances, because he was going to be filled with 3 vessels. He was going to be filled with Iman, Islam, and Ihsan. And so there had to be a complete emptying out in order. And this is one of the things that the Sahaba said about the Prophet ﷺ, that the Prophet used to empty us of Jahiliyyah and fill us with Islam. And so Islam is an emptying before it's a filling. And this is called takhliyah. Takhliyah, the people of this science say, at-takhliyatu tasbiq at-tahliyah, that the emptying out, it must precede the ornaments. In other words, you have to be stripped of the ugly before you can be ornamented with the beautiful. And so this is at the essence of the religious experience, is this emptying out of the world and being filled with a sense of the noumenal realm. And this obviously is what occurs to the Prophet ﷺ. Now, his second of these experiences. He has many experiences, but obviously that first experience, which is Iqra, the second experience, I mean, he has the experience as a child, but we're talking now of the prophetic experience, sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. The second experience is the Isra and the Mi'raj. Now, this is another deep spiritual experience, and this is the inner hijrah that is also related to the outer hijrah. And Ibn Qayyim al-Jawziyah wrote a book called The Two Hijrahs, because a lot of people think that hijrah is a physical movement. And the Prophet ﷺ negated that when he said that the real muhajir is the one who makes hijrah from what Allah has prohibited him. And Allah has prohibited us from everything other than Himself. So this experience that the Prophet ﷺ has, if you look at the Quranic description, it says, مَا زَاغَ الْبَصَرُ وَمَا طَغَى. His vision did not deviate. Now, we have to understand this in the context of what was happening to him. What was happening to him was he was moving through the seven heavens. And that means that he was being given unveilings of the unseen world. He was literally being given unveilings of the unseen world. Now, if we had unveilings right now, if Allah removed this veil from us, we would probably, the vast majority of us, would go into a state of insanity, quite literally, because we could not take it. We know now in our material sciences that we are seeing less than a billionth of the material stimuli at any given moment. In other words, when I look out in this room, I'm actually seeing less than a billionth of what is materially there to stimulate my senses. So my spectrum, like that extraordinary, and it's one of my favorite metaphors because it's such an extraordinary metaphor. Visible light is a very small spectrum on the electromagnetic spectrum. You have infrared and then you have the ultraviolet light. So it goes up and it goes down, and the waves get smaller and longer depending on which way you're going. Well, there's a very small spectrum within that electromagnetic continuum that we call visible light, and that is what we see. Now, that is the material world. That's what we've identified. That's not dealing yet with the ghaib. That's actually not ghaib, because the ghaib, we do not have access to it in the same way that we have access to the material world. We also know that in the sense that this is the dominant theory now, is that the overwhelming majority of the universe is dark matter. In other words, 95% of the universe, the physical universe, is actually not even perceived by us. So what we actually, when we look out there, and one of the interesting things that caused this is that when they began to look out and see stars everywhere, it just goes on and on and on. A question came, why isn't the night sky as light as the day sky? Because if light travels and all these lights are out there, the whole heavens are filled with just orbs of light, why aren't they filling up the night sky in the same way? Because we only see about 2,500 to 3,000 stars on a really clear moonless night. Why isn't it all stars? And what they realize is that only some stars are penetrating and actually going. It's a visitation, which is very interesting because the Quran says, وَالسَّمَاءِ وَالطَّارِقِ وَمَا أَدْرَاكَ مَا الطَّارِقِ النَّجْمُ ثَاقِبٌ. The night and the night visitor. And the star is a night visitor, which indicates that the light of the star is moving. It's a journey. And when it gets here, it is like a night visitor, quite literally. So the Quran describes stars as night visitors. And then it says what will convey to you what this night visitor is. It says, An-Najmu Thaqib, the piercing star. Now, Thaqib is to put a hole through pearl. And so the stars that are actually reaching us are like that. They are the ones that penetrate all of this extraordinary celestial light. So what we know about the seen world is incredibly small. And yet the unseen world we have no knowledge of. Now I want to look other than what we've been told, and those are called the sam'iyat, what we're told. Now I want to look just at the Isra and this idea that his vision did not deviate. If you were traveling through the unseen realm, And all of this unveiling was occurring. You were seeing all of this extraordinary unveiling. Why wouldn't your vision be looking at all of that? In other words, why wouldn't you be distracted? And that again goes back to the heart of the Prophet ﷺ, who had only one concern that night, and that was to visit his Lord. He was on a journey to God. And he was not interested in the particulars, because if you know God, you know everything. Like the poet said, كُلُّ مَا تَهْوَاهُ مَوْجُودٌ فِي ذَاتِ اللَّهِ. Everything you desire exists in God. So if you have God, you have your heart's desire. And everybody else, everything that human beings are running around out there looking for is ultimately, that's what it is. It's nothing else. Everybody's looking for the same thing. They are looking for their heart's desire. And that is why Imam al-Junayd once passed by a man who was about to get he was a thief, a brigand, qati' al-tariq. He was about to get his head chopped off. And he greeted him, and one of the students with him, he said, why would you greet a man like that? And he said, any man that will give his life for his desire, I respect. In other words, that sacrifice, that's somebody that's taking life very seriously. And that's why I actually, in some ways, I have a soft spot in my heart for atheists, and I'll tell you why. I've never met an atheist that didn't take God seriously. And yet I've met so many people in my life that are not atheists that just don't take God seriously. But I've yet to meet an atheist that does not take God very seriously. They're bothered by it. They're troubled by it. They read books about it. It ends up being a topic of discussion with them because that's how serious they take it. And one of the 7 deadly sins in Christianity, and they're certainly deadly in Islam as well, and to me it's the most interesting one. It's called sloth, acedia in Latin. And this sin, most people think of it as laziness, but it's not laziness. In Catholic tradition, sloth was spiritual lassitude. It was that you did not take your salvation seriously. That you literally squandered your time on earth and did not take your life seriously. And that is why the vast majority of us are in a slothful state. Even if we're spending all of our time working, if we are not thinking deeply about where we're going, what happens, then we're in a slothful state. We're spiritually lazy. And lazy people are uninspiring people, they're uninspired people, and they're held in contempt by even other lazy people. So, if we look at this experience of the Isra and the Mi'raj, it's an extraordinary experience because this is direct witnessing. But look at the preparation that took place before that. That is not how Islam began, is it? It began with Jibreel. It began with the intermediary. And then it was 13 years of persecution. And Thaqif is the experience that precedes the Isra, which is the lowest point of the Prophet's life on earth. According to the Prophet ﷺ, he said to Aisha, the worst time I had was at the hands of your people, Thaqif. That was the worst experience that he'd had. Total state of humiliation. The children threw rocks at him, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And then he was offered this opportunity for revenge, and he didn't take it. And his reason was the children. So he expressed not only his ultimate humanity, but just his extraordinary magnanimity in a moment when many, many people would have, in fact, most people, and certainly most males, would have wanted revenge. And he did not. And so he's followed on the way back, and then the jinn is another element because they become Muslims. So introduction also into this other world, and then ultimately the Isra and the Mi'raj. When he comes back from that experience, the Prophet ﷺ now is ready to move to the next phase, which is to be in the world. Because the world is no longer a threat to him. as a distraction. He now sees reality as it is. And this is what his prayer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was, show me things as they truly are. Show me things as they are. So he was given this extraordinary gift of seeing things as they truly are. And when he comes back to the world, he is able to be in the world in a way in which the world is no longer going to be not only a distraction to him, between him and his Lord. He will not misperceive the world. And this is called right understanding. And this is also in all of the world religions. There's an understanding or a first principle that everything begins with right understanding. That we must perceive the world correctly, because our lack of perception, our misperception of the world is what causes us pain. I mean, this is very interesting, and it's a motif that's very dominant in the Buddhist tradition, is this idea of your suffering comes from a lack of understanding of the nature of the world, because suffering is related to desire, at what we call in Arabic, what the Quran calls baghi. And baghi, which means desire, also means oppression, which is so, to me, that is so fascinating. The word for desire and the word for oppression are the same in Arabic. So freedom from desire, bughya, the freedom from desire is when you make your desire right desire. In other words, you have a right understanding of what you should want. Then the challenge is to make what you should want what you want. Because it's one thing to know what you should want. It's another thing to want that thing. Because there are plenty of people that are smoking that want good health. They know, I should want to stop smoking. And they will also say, I want to stop smoking. But really what they're saying is, I should want to stop smoking. And then they get to a point where they do want to stop smoking, and then the struggle begins. Knowing what you should want and knowing what you want are not the same. And most of us don't even know what we should want. And that is a big problem. Once we know what we should want, then it's how do we get to wanting what we should want. And once you want that thing, and want comes from a word which means to be impoverished, which is related to this idea of iftiqar, which is the definition of humanity. Creation in Arabic is al-muftaqiru ilallah. It is the one that wants, is in want of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That is the definition of creation. The definition of the Creator is the one free of want. Al-mustaghni an al-kull. Free of want. Has no want. Has no need. And so this idea of knowing what we should want and then wanting that thing. The Prophet ﷺ, when he comes back, he goes to Medina, and then the experience is translated into practice. And this is the next phase, is how do we translate our experience of the divine, a direct experience, into the world. And this is how he becomes the model for humanity, because he ta'akhlaqa bi akhlaqillah. He took on the divine qualities of these ethical qualities that God, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has described himself with. So if you look now, just in terms of what happens, this experience happens, and there's a story of the devil was walking with one of his disciples, and there was a man in front of him who stumbles on something, and he picks it up, and suddenly you see this illumination around this person. The disciple asked the devil, what just happened? He said, he just stumbled onto the truth. And he says, well, aren't you bothered? And he says, I'll get him to organize it tomorrow. So this is where we move now into the realm of how do we organize the experience? How do we schematize it? How do we put it into a creed? There is an incredible danger in that. And it's, in a sense, it's the decline of religion. And yet, at the same time, there's an absolute necessity for it. And that's why our scholars had to do it. I think they realized its danger, and that's where you get their great hesitation with this process, because I really believe, and I want to show you historically what happens and why it came to this extraordinary culmination that I don't see in any other religious tradition. None. I really don't. I'm not an expert on comparative religions or religious. That was my university major, but I can't say that I'm an expert by any means. I don't know the languages that are necessary, look at the primary sources. But in the overall presentations and educated summaries of the religions that I've looked at, I've never seen anything that comes close to this, and that's why I want to look at it. When you look at religion, ultimately religion is experience, and then that experience enters into propositions. The experiences become propositions. I believe that Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah, one of the beauties for me of our creedal formula is that it is not just a testimony, because shahada means to testify, it also means witness. And that's why I believe that the beauty of Islam is that it has enabled the proposition to be experience also. It will not be experience for everybody, but we can say the shahada in two ways. We can say, Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah. In other words, I see that there is no God but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Or we can say, I testify. That Arabic word holds both those meanings. So it's not just experience, experience is there, but there's also the creedal formula. Now, I personally believe that the Sahaba, and certainly the Messenger of Allah, were in that first understanding. Not all of them. That's what I believe. I believe that they were not saying, I testify. They were saying, I see. I am witnessing. I am experiencing the truth of La ilaha illallah. And that is the difference between them and the vast majority of the rest of us. And that is why they're such an extraordinary community. And I think Abu Bakr is, after the Prophet ﷺ, the greatest witness. He has the greatest experience of that, and that's why he never falters. He never wavers. He never has any hesitation, because he was in a state of witnessing. And Haritha is probably another excellent example of that. كيف أصبحت يا حارثة أصبحت مؤمنا حقا. He said, how have you woken up? It's a Hasan hadith. How have you woken up? He said, I've woken up a true believer. In other words, something happened to him in which he went from a mu'min to a mu'min haqqan. He's qualifying his state of iman, that there is a qualitative difference between my state of iman this morning than other mornings. And the Prophet ﷺ said, think about what you're saying, because every reality has a proof. What is the proof of your reality? And then he gives the description, that I am experiencing Jannah as if it's right here, and I can hear people moaning from the agony of hell. He was in a state of experience. And the Prophet ﷺ said, Arafta falzam. You have ma'rifah. You have true knowledge now. So hold tight to it, because you can lose that. Hold tight to it. Now, if you look at what happens, one of the extraordinary things about our tradition is always in the time of greatest need, you can see providence, the providential care that has been in this religion. And providence, it comes from, similar to provide. It's that God gives you what you need when you need it. That is providence. And we can see providence in our tradition if you look at it. I'll give you an example. At the point in which it was absolutely necessary to codify the sacred law, these four imams emerged. Same time. The basic same time. One didn't come 100 years after the others. They were students of each other, with the exception of Ahmad ibn Hanbal. They were benefiting from each other. Ahmad ibn Hanbal is a student of Imam Shafi'i, and Imam Shafi'i takes from Ahmad. Obviously, he then is a student of Abu Hanifa and Malik through that, because the chain is there. So these men all appear at this same time. Now, the other extraordinary period is the time of the creedal formation and the time also of the spiritual knowledge. And I want to show how all of these three come together in a unique and extraordinary human being, and why that, to me, is one of the proofs of Islam. The three men who give us a creedal understanding, and I'm not going to go into, and it's interesting, it's fascinating to go into a lot of the historical, the Mu'tazilite and what happens with Wasil ibn Ata and Nizam and all these different, and also the Khawarij. I mean, there's some really interesting characters that show up and cause a lot of trouble. But generally, one of the most common problems in religious tradition is what is known as the reason-tradition dichotomy. We call it aql wa naql, the aql and naql dichotomy. That most religious traditions, in fact all of the world traditions, have a problem in resolving this essential split, which is how do we get tradition to conform to reason or reason to conform to tradition. Now in Islam there's an early split, which is the Mu'tazila, who are the rationalists. They take this Hellenistic tradition, and this is essentially what philosophy is, because theology is divided into two broad demarcations. Natural theology, which is the theology of reason, and revealed theology, which is the theology of tradition. These are two, within systematized religion, these are the two ways of looking at it. The philosophers are the people that are interested in natural philosophy. They're not interested in revealed philosophy. Now, the first two early philosophers in the 3rd century are Al-Kindi and Al-Farabi. And both of them attempted to create a rational basis for tradition. And this is a deep-seated interest in the West, and something that the Muslims abandoned largely, with the exception of the Shia tradition. The Sunni Muslims abandoned this pursuit. The Christians did not. And it led to real problems later on for Christians, especially the Catholic Church, because of St. Thomas Aquinas. When the Hellenistic ideas about God and about the idea of the cosmos being eternal, coexistent with God, and that what God was the cybernetic force in the universe. He was the unifying factor. He was the one that molded chaos. So the Greeks had this idea of cosmos and chaos, that the Hayula or the Hela was this eternal substance, and what happens is that there's an unmoved mover that's affecting all of this. And these ideas came into Islam and caused a lot of problems early on in the 3rd century. Well, they move on. They have their own strain, and those are called Muslim philosophers. And they're an interesting lot, and they're brilliant, and they have a massive impact on the West. They have a much greater impact on the West than they do on the Muslims. I mean, really. They alter the Western civilization completely. I mean, Western civilization takes a sharp turn as a result, particularly of Averroes or Ibn Rushd, who is ultimately a student of Ibn Sina, who's a student of Al-Farabi, who's a student of Al-Kindi in thought. So you have that strain. Those are the natural theologians. And the 5 proofs of the existence of God that are so famous in the West from St. Thomas Aquinas are, and I've seen Edgar Myers shows exactly where he got them from Al-Farabi. And he puts side by side St. Thomas's Latin version and the Arabic version, and then the translation, and you can see that it's literally a direct translation from Al-Farabi. So, the Christians were using Muslim proofs. Now, that strain, don't think that this idea of proving the existence of God has anything to do with doubt about God. Doubt about God is a modern concept. There are very few ancients who had any doubts about God. And the people trying to prove the existence of God were largely deeply religious people. They were deeply devout people. So why do you think they would try to prove the existence of God? Because they felt that faith should be based in reason. They felt that in order for faith to be on firm foundation, it should have the foundation of reason. And that's why they attempted, to the best of their ability, to create a rational foundation for belief. And this again gets to reason and tradition, this problem. So they were trying to synthesize the essential problem of aql and naql. How do we get naql to correspond with aql, or vice versa? And they made many, many attempts. At a certain point, because of massive confusion that was beginning to reign in the Islamic lands, a group of people show up. One was in Egypt, Abu Ja'far al-Tahawi, and he dies in 321, which is 933 of the Christian era. The second is from Basra and teaches in Baghdad, two cities that are in the news a lot. And in those days, the wars were with sandals in the mosques, throwing shoes at each other when they disagreed. Abu Hassan al-Ash'ari, now they're using them to hit statues and things like that. So tradition's hard to get rid of. Abu Hassan al-Ash'ari, who dies in 324, and that's 935. And then Abu Mansur al-Maturidi, he's born in Maturid and dies in Samarkand, in what's called traditionally Khorasan, the land where the sun rises. Khorasan, sun is sun, Khora. So it's Khorasan, the land where the sun comes up, which is the East or Asia. We would call it now Central Asia. And he comes from that place. Now, what's interesting about Central Asia is he came from a place that was a center of Buddhist learning. And I find this deeply significant. I actually wrote a paper called How the Buddhists Saved Islam. It's a paper in which I tried, and I've never seen this anywhere, but I really tried to show that the paradoxical formulas that are introduced by the Maturidis and the Ash'aris were actually coming out of Buddhist logic. And the Buddhists had a massive impact. A lot of people don't know this, but they actually had a massive impact. The tolerance of the Abbasid period, I believe, is largely due to the influence of Buddhism, because the Barmekkids, who were the great ministers of the Abbasids, were from Afghanistan. And that family was a famous Buddhist priest family. They're very tolerant, deeply tolerant people. And they introduced a lot of this extraordinary tolerance during the Abbasid period into the Islamic tradition and removed a lot of the very harsh interpretations. And they textually justified it, which is what's so beautiful. And that's why the danger of religion is that it is open to multiple textual interpretations. And it's which one are you going to choose? And in a sense, that is revealing something about your essential nature. What are you attracted to? Because you can find harshness, you can find cruelty in all the religion. And then you can find all these other qualities. And I feel that the other qualities are the dominant qualities. It's almost like those harsh and cruel aspects. It's like a shadow, a Jungian shadow religion that exists alongside the true religion to almost separate people and to reveal themselves. Because hypocrisy is the worst type of personality, the one who's hiding his true nature. So these three men all are existing. I mean, look at that. 333, 321, 324, and 333. I mean, this is their death dates. So these three men are all living at the same time, and they formulate these creeds that basically save Islam. Now, Imam al-Tahawi is more of a naql. He's not interested in aql. And he has very few, if any, he has a few, but he has very few what is mistermed speculative theological formulas. It's mistermed. I would say more rational. The Abu Hassan al-Ash'ari is, in a sense, a bridge between aql and naql. But Imam Abu Ja'far al-Maturidi takes it to a much deeper level, the three, in terms of this fundamental problem. And what's interesting is the great creedal formula of the Muslims becomes the formula of Imam al-Nasafi, who was a Maturidi, with the commentary of Taftazani, who was an Ash'ari. And this is what was taught in our madrasas for centuries. I mean, these are the two great texts. One is a commentary by an Ash'ari, but the other is a creed by a Maturidi. And these three men represent what comes to be known as Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah. They basically create creeds. They produce creeds. And credo in Latin means I believe. So a creed is what you believe. You say credo, I believe. And that's why in the beginnings of these creeds they always say aqulu mu'taqidan. I say believing. So the aqidah is what you're bound to. It's what you have conviction about. You know, it's aqadtu. It's what you're knotted. It's what you've bound to. It's what you believe and have conviction about. And this becomes the aqidah. This is the word that's used in ours for the creed. So they call it the aqidah al-nasafiyya, the aqidah al-tahawiyya, the aqidah al-ash'ariyya, like that. And then each one of these, Imam Abu Ja'far al-Tahawi and Imam al-Maturidi are the two Hanafis. And Imam al-Ash'ari, there's a debate. The Malikis claim him as a Maliki, and the Shafi'is claim him as a Shafi'i. So, and I think probably the stronger argument is that he was a Shafi'i, but his greatest student by one, there is a mediary between the two. His greatest student is Abu Bakr al-Baqallani, who was a Maliki scholar who develops what's known as the atomic theory in Islam, and it's probably the most sophisticated pre-modern theory. And there's a book called The History of the Atom, and there is a chapter on the Muslim atomic theory, and they do admit that. The scientist that wrote that book said that this is clearly the most sophisticated pre-modern atomic theory that we have. And he also says that he doesn't really understand how they got it, the Muslims. And so they were thinking very deeply about that. Now, I believe also there's a connection between the Buddhist atomic theory and Abu Bakr al-Baqallani's theory, because there's a lot of similarities. And that is obviously deep speculation, and there's Muslims that did not like that at all. And that tended to be, within the Hanbali tradition, you have a fourth strain. From these three men, you have a fourth strain, which is the Hanbali strain. The Hanbalis tended to be, although Abu Hasan al-Ash'ari would use Imam Ahmad as his foundation, in a sense, because Imam Ahmad was considered the Imam of Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah. It's his laqab, because he had such an important role to play in protecting Islam from the Mu'tazilites. He was honored with that. And so, in that sense, now Imam of the four Imams, the three Imams, Abu Hanifa, Malik, and Shafi'i, have more room for aql, and the most is Abu Hanifa radiallahu anhu. He is the most rational. He is a legal philosopher in a way. Imam Shafi'i is also, but Abu Hanifa will use aql more than any of the other Imams. Ahmad ibn Hanbal is the least inclined to do that. He will prefer a weak hadith over analogical reasoning, and that is in his madhab, which gives total lie to this idiotic idea that weak hadiths have no place in Islam. If Ahmad ibn Hanbal uses weak hadiths before he uses qiyas in his usul, I think that exposes the ignorance of people who claim that weak hadiths are worthless. On the contrary, they've been used for centuries by our greatest scholars. So, of those three, of the four strains, the Hanbali strain will be the least inclined to any type of rational approach to creed. And it will get to the point where the anthropomorphists, who are a problem in all religions, not just the Muslims, this phenomenon is a phenomenon within religion, are people that take things literally. In other words, believe in the literal meaning of everything that is said. And that is absolutely impossible to do with any text of Revelation, because the nature of language is that there is always analogy and metaphor, always. You cannot get out of it. It's impossible. It is simply impossible. And it leads to very difficult, even the literalists who deal with the Quran, they get into big problems in interpreting certain verses in the Quran and create very clever rhetorical devices to deal with those problematic verses for them. Like ask the town, fasal al-qarya, ask the town. How do you ask a town? What's a town? What do you mean ask the town? Do you mean ask the people of the town? Do you mean ask, if it's literally the town. Town, can I ask you a question? Chicago, I'd like to ask you. Well, I can say that. I want to hear what Chicago has to think about all this. Now, obviously, you people here from Chicago. Well, that's metaphor. And that's in language. It's just the way it is. The White House announced today. Nobody saw these bricks that are painted white saying something, right? At least as far as I know. Announced things. So this aql and naql is what Abu Mansur al-Maturidi is trying to bring together, this understanding. Now, the third formulation is amongst the people who deal with ihsan, or the spiritual science of Islam. So the providential care that we see in this community is during the period we see Al-Harith al-Muhasibi, who's 243, Imam al-Junayd, who is probably the great formulator of the tradition, in 297, and then Ash-Shibli, his student, 334, Abu Talib al-Makki, 386, and then I would add Rabi' al-Adawiyya to that, because she introduced the idea. She really is credited with the introduction of the idea of love of God being higher than fear of God. And it's a very important introduction into the Islamic tradition. The Bakka'un, who were these men that literally became so enveloped with fear of God that they stopped eating, they'd cry all the time. They were basically dysfunctional from this immense fear. And she introduces this idea that love is such a higher concept when dealing with the divine. And that becomes very strong within that tradition. Now, that Islam, the four Imams, Iman, these four traditions, and then ihsan, these four imams, and adding Rabi'a as the fifth in that science. They basically formulate Iman, Islam, and ihsan. It becomes a religion in the sense that we can study it in an organized, schematized way. That was not true in the first community. It just wasn't, because much of it was experiential. And you could ask the Sahaba, they knew all these things. They had immense knowledge of all three subjects, but they did not have Bab al-Wudu, or Bab al-Tahara, or Bab al-Nikah, and dividing Nikah into different types, and having different types, Salih and Fasid, or the 5 formulations. So here you have the philosophers that are pure rationalists. You have the traditionalists, which were the Muhaddithun, who are pure traditionalists. They're not interested in aql, they're interested in naql. And that's why the fuqaha say the muhaddith is a pharmacist. He's not a doctor. So never get a prescription from a pharmacist. All the pharmacist knows is naql. See, what the doctor has is aql. He knows how to apply, he knows how to put things together, he knows how to, we hope. Right? But that's what the physician, he learns how to discern between signs and symptoms, what if you have jaundice, what that means, and then what is the prognosis, where it's going, all these things. So that's the faqih. And rarely do you get the two together. Now the same is true about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's these creedal formulations. You have the creed, which is naql, but then you have to have an understanding of it. This is aql. And so bringing these two together, this is what Fakhruddin al-Razi says is the meaning of nurun ala nur. That light upon light is revelation on intellect. And Raghib al-Isfahani said, never be impressed with a person's Islam until you've tested their intellect. Because the most dangerous thing that you can have is intellect without religion, or religion without intellect. It's a disaster. Both are disasters. Intellect without religion leads to concentration camps, gas chambers. We've got a problem. It's called the Jewish problem. And what's the most efficient way to deal with this problem? This is pure reason. There's people that could argue against that, but ultimately, this is how they perceive the world. This is how Nazi Germany perceived the world. Efficiency. And we were the Übermensch. We're the people beyond good and evil. We're not, because in the Kantian moral argument for the existence of God, what Kant says is the understanding of good and evil is the greatest proof for the existence of God. Because without God, you could have no understanding of good and evil. And this is what happens when revelation is removed from intellect, because intellect can be evil. And this is what, in the golden mean, intellect is a mean between craftiness and between stupidity. So the intellect can be used for evil. And religion without intellect leads also to gas chambers. They might be metaphorical ones, but again, we have a problem. the Americans are our problem. Well, let's just kill them all. I mean, that's a great solution. Because God said, kill them wherever you find them. So let's just do that. I mean, this is what happens when you divorce one from the other. You end up with the same result, which is brutality, a loss of your humanity. It's really extraordinary. And this is why bringing these two together is so difficult, and yet our religion has been so brilliant at doing it. And the man that did it is called the proof of Islam, Hujjatullah al-Ghazali. He is the man that brought it all together. He brought the fiqh, the usul. He was a master. He's one of the greatest usuli scholars in history. He brought the aqidah. He brought the philosophical tradition, and he brought the spiritual tradition, and he synthesized it into this extraordinary exposition of Islam where he said, don't fight each other. These are not mutually exclusive meanings. Can't you see you're all looking at things from a different perspective, and what you need to recognize is this is a diamond that has different facets. And it is the divine light that comes into that diamond that refracts it into this extraordinary rainbow of colors that yasurra nadirin, delight those who look at it.
This session continues on the following CD.